ways to make something work and then leave and think, oh, why did I just do that? That's worse than an alternative that I could have pursued outside of the negotiation. So those are 5 common pitfalls people experience. Now, next is to identify what kind of negotiation you're in, distributive or integrative. And to be sure, this is a little bit of a mislabel, as you'll see, but negotiations are often characterized this way to signal what kind of strategies are actually useful. So on the right-hand side of the page, so to speak, is a picture of a pie that is currently being sliced. So it's as big as it's going to be, and at this point it's just about how many pieces of pie each person is going to get. So it's this notion of once you have a set amount of value, that is pieces of pie, how do you distribute them to the parties involved? And the idea is, say you wanted 5 pieces, say naturally you were with one other person and you were each going to eat a lot and then be sick, and you each wanted 4 pieces of pie. Okay, arguably that's equal. But all of a sudden, say you decide, you know what, I'm hungrier than I thought, and I want 5 pieces of pie. So the minute you claim that +1 slices of pie, that's a win for you at the expense of the other party. So when you get +1 pieces of pie, the other party gets -1 pieces of pie. And it cancels out. If you add +1 plus -1, it cancels out to 0. So it's called a zero-sum game, wherein often there's a single issue. In this case, we'll say the number of pieces of pie. You both want them, you want the maximum numbers of pieces of pie as possible. And as a consequence, it's about who can get the most of the pie. And it's often the case that there's no future relationship in which these kinds of transactions happen, or the mindset of win-lose comes in. Now, on the left-hand side is this notion of win-win, which would be the case if you were in the ugly orange negotiation and you realized that what seemed to be, we'll say, a smaller piece of pie or a smaller pie could actually be made bigger. So you might have gone in as a researcher and thinking, well, shoot, maybe I'm going to get 1,500 oranges and my counterpart would get 1,500. And because there's only a set amount of value in those 3,000 oranges, but then you realize, shoot, I need the peel and he or she needs the juice, in which case all of a sudden both of you can win to the maximum amount. So the pie is made bigger. So the key is to get as much value out of a negotiation as possible. The goal in this case, often what enables the creation of value is that people are in it for themselves, but they're also recognizing the interests of the other party. And to get very briefly right now to the other article that you read on investigative negotiation, if you notice, the article espouses that you need really to get to people's underlying interests, okay? That is the reasons for their positions. Why are people positing or proposing the positions that they have? So a position is your stated demand, like I want $4,000. Well, the interest underlying that is the hope, concern, desires that create the I want $4,000. So really the goal is to get to those underlying interests, but you have to ask for people's interests. You have to understand why they're asking for the things that they ask for. And then often the way that you get, and we'll get to this a little bit later, to create value is that you happen to have multiple issues, because what you find out is that people prioritize one thing more than the other. So let me just give you another basic example. If I and a colleague were vying for office space, if we just think of it in very broad terms, there are only a certain number of offices available, and maybe it seems like a distributive issue or a distributive negotiation because there's only one issue, that is office. But if we break down office into issues, that is, for example, the size of an office and whether the office has a view, maybe it turns out I really love a great view and I'm willing to sacrifice a bigger office to get a view, whereas my colleague really doesn't care about a view, could have no window, but really wants size because he or she has, multiple computers, more storage that he or she needs to have. So we could do, it's what's called log roll, wherein I get the office with the bigger or the window, and he or she gets the bigger office space. So the key is often what seems to be a single issue in a negotiation could be broken down into more. And to be sure, you're often people in a long-term relationship often treat the negotiation as a win-win because they care about the other party and they want their underlying interests to be met as well. So the question is, how would you characterize biopharm or tech soil? Was there just one issue involved in this, or more than one? And that's really how you start to tease these apart. I'll get to that in just a minute. To be sure, most negotiations are mixed sum in nature. That is, they have some elements that are distributive and some that are integrative. So in terms of issues, when you think about issues, what it may mean is there are multiple issues, and I prioritize some over the other, and it turns out that you do the same. So we can create more value wherein I get the things I care most about and you get the things you care most about, and we give up on the things or let the other person have what we don't want or we care less about. So to be sure, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but one of the ways to become an excellent negotiator is to recognize the issues at hand. Is it predominantly distributive? Is it predominantly integrative? Can you create more value? Can you make what seems like a smaller pie bigger? What seems to be distributive actually integrated by bringing more value into a negotiation? Okay, so to get to biopharm cell tech, biopharm cell tech is largely a distributive negotiation. And the reason for that is because predominantly the issue that you're dealing with here is the price of the plant. Okay, so price tends to be a natural situation in which people have opposing interests. A seller wants to sell for as much money as he or she can, and the buyer wants to buy for as little amount of money as he or she can. So when, say, the seller gets a good deal on price, by nature, in direct proportion, if I said the seller, then the buyer gets a worse price. So every win for a seller is a loss for the buyer and vice versa. So because price is a set, it has a set amount of value in this case, it becomes distributive. So we'll get to that more in a particular case, or a little bit later here. So I wrote, in a basic sense, a distributive situation involves a fixed set of resources, in this case price, and requires you to claim as much value as you can get. You're looking at a fixed pie, how many slices can you get? Now, the goals in biopharm cell tech were to help you understand some key distributive concepts, including what's called BATNA, resistance points, targets, anchoring, and concessions, and how to employ them in a distributive situation. These are things you must think about, frankly, in any negotiation. Okay, now again, to be sure, I've already talked about this, but I want to make sure we understand. A distributive bargaining situation, it's when goals of one party are in fundamental direct conflict with the other party. So in this case, money. I want to sell high, you want to sell low. You really can't get around that. So it's zero sum, meaning one party's gain when added to the other's equal loss is zero. Resources are fixed and limited. There can't be more resources brought in, and the goal is to maximize as much of the value that can exist or the resources available for yourself. So each of the negotiations were distributive in some way, but biopharm has a major distributive component, that is the sales price of the plant. Okay, let me get back to that in just a minute. Let me go to our actual discussion notes. So to be sure, here are 4 examples of biopharm cell tech outcomes. And so you can see here, by the way, the general amount that I see is about 9 million to usually about 22 million. Okay, so those are the typical ranges that I see. It's kind of rare to see anything outside of that. And you could see in these 4 sets of negotiators, there was a range, from 9 to 18. Now imagine if you were the seller, so Eli, and you negotiated and you sold your plant and you secured for Cell Tech $9 million, and then realized that Leslie was able to secure $18 million for the same exact amount. So, I mean, in this particular case, if it were real, we're talking millions of dollars. Now, one thing that I want to get to, actually, I will get to this first offer shortly, but let's get to some of the questions here. Okay, so do they, let me get to